All right, everybody. That's right. Are once again back. A little late. Had some schoolwork to catch up on, you know. But hey, we're finally out. A couple days late, but we finally made it with this adjustment. That's right. Today's topic is going to be all about how you adjust mid-game in mid-series specifically. So, looking ahead here, let's just briefly go over the format real quick, as I'm sure you're well aware at this point, several weeks in. It's a best of three. Starting at semis, it's going to be a BO5, but these general rules still kind of apply. And whenever you lose a game, that means you can change the team that you brought. Winner of the last game cannot make any changes, so if you lose game 1, you can now change your team going into game 2, but if you win that game and force a game 3, that means you're stuck with the team you brought game 2 for that final game. So, what does this mean for us? How should you approach adjustments? Well, there's a couple different ways things that change how you should make your adjustments. The most obvious of which is if you lose game 1 or win game 1. This pretty drastically changes the way that you should be approaching your adjustments. Because losing game 1 means that you have to take a much more safe approach. Obviously, if you lose game 1, that means you're going to be stuck with the same team for 2 games in a row, which that alone means that you're going to have to be pretty consistent. It's going to be a strategy that is capable of just going through 2 games in a row, and also through counter adjustments. So, how should you approach this, and how should you attempt on making a consistent game? So first of all, you want to ask yourself what worked game 1, assuming you have a pretty solid game plan going into game 1, right? Obviously, it's not going to be perfect, right? Especially since you lost in this scenario. Something went wrong along the way, but presumably not everything was completely terrible, alright? So you got to ask yourself what worked and what didn't, alright? And separate that wheat from the chaff, right? So you want to take the good, and you want to edit the bad to make it more consistent, right? The idea is that you just want to strengthen your game plan, and you don't really want to take super big risks, because again, a consistent game plan is the key to winning 2 games in a row. It's hard. I'll be honest. It's hard to win 2 games in a row, and that's why winning game 1 is such a big advantage. But what does this consistent game plan look like? So, should be something reliant that you can do game to game, right? If you feel like your game 1 plan worked out pretty well, maybe a couple turns at the end just didn't go your way, or maybe you just got crit, feel free to at least run back a similar team, or only make a few handful of changes. That's definitely something that is pretty valid. But something that can be done game to game, for example, is like a strong hazard setter. If your spike setter is something like Ogerpon or Mew, where they can get up spikes pretty consistently, it's gonna be a lot better than planning your game plan around, say, like Spidoffs setting spikes, right? Plan your game plan around these consistent Pokemon, because I mean these lower tier Pokemon, especially when you start getting down to like 4 or 5 3-point Pokemon, are like good, unless they're really good in this one specific niche, are more there to catch people off guard. So you don't really want to be planning your game 2 adjustments around these things. So these are not really going to be including strategies that are easy to adapt to. Sticky Webs is an obvious example here. There's a lot of very obvious and easy counterplay in adjustments, even if you do cheese out a win with Sticky Webs. Game 2, there's going to be a lot of easy changes that make your strategy completely irrelevant, and just completely shut you down, because again, it doesn't really matter if you win game 2 if game 3 is just going to be a wash. So this also includes, for this next point, I don't want to say cheese, but like surprise moves are maybe a better word. The example and the picture I have here is the Hyper Beam Sylveon we saw a week ago, with Rick Salas against Jamark, which isn't really cheese because it had like a specific reason to Oko Blastoise, but like it's definitely one of those moves where it's a surprise. Like one of the biggest parts about it is that you will never see it coming, right? So if your plan is revolving around something like one of these moves where a big part of why it works is because you don't see it coming, that's not really what you want to be doing going into game 2. Unless you think you can win the game without it, at which point, if you make it all the way to game 3 without revealing it, then that becomes really powerful, to be honest. Because now you really won't be expecting it. You're expecting a more your opponent is expecting a more consistent game plan, and overall, it just makes that surprise hit a lot harder. I think a big example we saw of this was Vaughn's game against Temple. This is all the way at the beginning of the season, but Vaughn's game against Temple, where he did not reveal Scarf Samurott until the very end, and it won him the game. That is a good example of hiding, not cheese, again, it's not the right word, but these surprise movesets, and leveraging that to a big advantage game 3 when it's not really expected. So, we talked about losing game 1, but let's talk about winning game 1 and then losing game 2. This is obviously going to put you at a big advantage, right? A big part of this game, especially in draft, is information gathering. You're poking and you're prodding in the early game, trying to figure out what sets you have, what EVs you have, and like seeing what works, what doesn't, right? And when you win game 1, you play game 2. It's like you're playing poker, right? And your opponent's cards are all face up on the table. And imagine you're dealt a fresh new hand, right? And you can just specifically see what you need for that scenario. Your opponent is at a massive disadvantage. They've already played all their cards, and you can change literally everything. All right, so what should we be doing with this strategic advantage, with this information advantage? You know, for one, exactly what movesets your opponent are running. Maybe not their exact, you like maybe didn't see 1 move or 2 moves, but like for the most part, you're well aware of what sets and movesets your opponent can run. So a good example is like maybe there was a coverage move that you were afraid of from this one mon, but now you know he doesn't have it. You can bring out the Pokemon that walls this specific moveset now. So the key to this is really taking your time and thinking about how you can abuse this open information, right? You have to think about what these specific sets can and can't do and apply that to your Pokemon. Really think about, is there any way I could take advantage of the gaps in these sets? You also have another game of data to go over and experience. So you want to ask yourself what patterns you've seen in both games. Say, for example, in prep, there's a defensive Pokemon that you're really afraid of it walling X offensive Pokemon on your team. So you don't bring that offensive Pokemon. But after 2 games, you see that this defensive wall gets worn down really easily and really quickly throughout the games. Maybe now you consider actually just bringing that offensive mon that gets walled. And then throughout the game, it gets worn down really easily. And now that offensive Pokemon that you thought would be walled just runs over the game. Because in practice, the way that these games have been playing out, that defensive wall does not last very long. So you really want to think about not just the sets, but how the games have been playing out. And this is also, like I mentioned earlier, a better time for these unexpected sets. Going into Game 3, again, there's only 1 game left no matter what. So if you've been holding something out, now is the time to kind of pull that out, right? Whereas it would put you at a disadvantage if you lost Game 1. Winning Game 1 means that having surprise sets like this actually give you a massive advantage instead. So, just something to think about there. Couple things I've seen. Building a second team is something that I've heard mentioned sometimes. It's something I used to do initially, like 2-3 seasons ago for a little, but it's not really worth the time. I am talking about going into a week with 2 different teams. First of all, I think it's probably just better to have one solid game plan, and fine-tuning that. And then, when you need to make adjustments, just making adjustments to that one team instead of just completely flipping the team style. But it is worth noting, if you think there is a different team style you think could work, I think that is well worth noting in case something goes wrong. Gives you something to fall back on. If you just you go load in a game and your game plan just is getting shut down and completely donkeyed on. So that is something to think about. It also gives a curveball to just like completely mix up going into like game 3 or something. Completely mix up your opponent if you want to. But I wouldn't really worry about that too much unless you already have a fairly solid idea of a team style that could work. One last thing I wanted to mention. You should always take your time for adjustments. I've seen it many times in this league where you lose a game and you just make the salty run back. Immediately challenge again, barely or maybe not at all change your team, and you're just sabotaging yourself, to be quite honest with you. I understand, especially if you feel like you got robbed, like you got crit or something, and you're like, damn, that sucks. I'm just gonna, you just go for the salty run back. Don't do that. Even if you truly believe you don't have any changes to make, that's fine. It's probably not true, but that's fine, right? But just go, I don't know, make yourself some tea or something, meditate, go for a walk for 5 minutes, just something to make sure that, like, you're just giving so much away if you just go for the salty run back. You're telegraphing your opponent right away. I haven't made any changes. I'm on a perfectly open information book. Do with that as you will, and that's just not where you want to be. Alright, so just take the 5 minutes, man. Just take the 5 minutes. I promise you, you will be so much better off for it, and it will be harder to play against you. So that's about all I have today. Not too much in this, just kind of a thought process video on how you want to be approaching these adjustments and what you should be looking for. Lastly, I wanted to take an example of what good adjustments look like. This is from all the way back in week 1, sorry, but it's kind of playing on this slide here, right? You know exactly what your opponent can and cannot do, and how should you take advantage of it. So, this is going to be week 1 of Jamark versus Josh here. Now, Jamark has won game 1, putting him in that advantageous position, and he now has full open information going into this. So, there's a couple notable things here. For one, there is no dark types. And for 2, there's not a lot of disruption for this Reuniclus. So, this Reuniclus comes off the bench. He was not in game 1 or 2. And knowing this, he comes off and he kind of just wins the game. We're going to see here, Glacier comes out. It's dealt with fairly early. Yeah, so he's pretty much out of the game now. Gets a spike up, and now this Reuniclus is going to come out and just win the game. Traditional tools like Toxic don't work on Reuniclus. The Acid Armor comes out. Now it's going to be eating up this U-turn or this knockoff. And now he can kind of just set up and resist this Dragapult, and it's kind of just over. We're going to see Clodsire come up, try to Toxic it. It's not going to work. And this Reuniclus is just going to run over the game because of a good analysis from Jamark. He saw that Reuniclus kind of had the opportunity to just kind of tear this game wide open, and he took that and he ran with it. So, very well played from him, and a great example of taking advantage of your opponent's sets going into game 3. So, just kind of seeing some of these principles in action, and just something to try and take into your game. So yeah, it's going to be all today. Thank you very much. Have a good one. Good luck in your games. Like, subscribe, yada yada yada. Alright, I'm out.